He didn't snap overnight. He didn't lose control suddenly. And according to someone who lived with him years before the murders, this ending was already written. What if the most disturbing warning signs didn't appear days before the crime, but 15 years earlier? And what if the people who saw it coming were ignored until it was too late? Because tonight, we're uncovering what most headlines still aren't telling you, the pattern behind the Nick Riner case that changes everything. Long before police tape wrapped around a quiet home, long before headlines used words like murder, trial, and insanity defense, there were warnings, clear ones hiding in plain sight. The first crack in this story doesn't begin with a crime scene. It begins in Malibu, California, inside a luxury rehab facility overlooking the ocean. A place designed for healing. A place that costs $60,000 a month. A place filled with yoga sessions, private chefs, therapy circles, and carefully curated calm. And inside that place, two teenagers shared a room. One of them was Nick Riner. The other was a boy who would later say something chilling: "As soon as I saw the news that Rob Reiner and his wife Michelle were murdered, I knew exactly who it was." That statement matters, because it wasn't said out of shock, or confusion, or speculation. It was said with certainty. At 15 years old, Nick Riner was already cycling through elite rehab programs. Not because his parents had given up on him, but because they were doing everything possible to save him. Friends of the family described Rob and Michelle Riner as deeply involved parents. Not absentee, not distant, present, consistent, relentless in their efforts to help their son. And that's where the contradiction begins. According to Danny Speiler, the former roommate who shared nights, walls, and whispered conversations with Nick, the anger didn't surface occasionally. It lived there. It lingered. It came out after lights were off, when no one else was listening. Night after night, Nick would talk. Not about fear, not about confusion, but about hatred. Danny says Nick spoke obsessively about his parents, especially his father. The language wasn't teenage frustration. It wasn't rebellion. It was rage. Raw, unfiltered, directed. He would go on about how much he hated them, Danny recalled. Not once, not during a meltdown, but repeatedly. Hey, race, why this matters. This was before hard drugs, before adult pressures, before legal consequences. At 15, according to multiple accounts, Nick's substance use was largely limited to marijuana, yet the hostility was already fully formed. That timeline is critical because it challenges one of the central narratives now forming around the case. Danny described Nick as charismatic at first. Funny, welcoming, easy to talk to. But then something would flip. A comment, a joke, a perceived slight, and the temperature in the room would change instantly. One night, Danny made what most people would consider a harmless remark that Nick resembled John Travolta's son. Instead of laughing it off, Nick erupted. He stepped forward, raised a fist, became physically aggressive. Staff had to intervene. This wasn't an isolated incident. Danny claims he witnessed Nick attack another teen at the facility. Claims Nick was eventually removed from their shared room because his behavior became unpredictable, even dangerous. And yet, behind the scenes, Nick's parents kept showing up. While many families at the rehab relied on handlers, assistants, or legal buffers, Rob and Michelle Riner attended therapy sessions themselves. Family group meetings, weekends, activities. Danny remembers playing frisbee with Rob, talking casually, seeing parents who didn't need to care but chose to anyway. That contrast is haunting, because while they were investing millions into his recovery, Nick reportedly showed no gratitude, no appreciation, only resentment toward their fame, their success, their status. In Nick's words, according to Danny, his parents were the reason for his problems. Their fame, he believed, had ruined his life. But hey, race the rehook the detail, most people miss every other teen in that facility had complaints about their parents. Yet nearly all of them, Danny says, expressed gratitude for the help they were receiving. Nick didn't. He stood apart. Emotionally, psychologically, morally. And when someone who lived with him at 15 sees a murder headline 15 years later and feels no surprise, that's not hindsight. That's a warning that was ignored. And the question now becomes unavoidable: if these signs were visible, then who else saw them, and what did they choose not to say? When investigators look at violent crimes like this, they don't just ask what happened. They ask when it started. Because acts like these rarely appear out of nowhere. They leave a trail not of blood, but of behavior. And in the Nick Riner case, that trail didn't fade with time. It hardened. Years passed after that Malibu rehab. Nick grew older. The facilities changed. The programs became more intense, more expensive, more isolated. Utah, California, private treatment centers, structured environments meant to contain chaos. But according to those closest to the situation, the core problem never moved. The anger didn't evolve. It didn't soften. It waited. This is where federal investigators begin paying attention because patterns matter more than excuses. A retired FBI agent later involved in analyzing the case would describe something crucial: long-term resentment is not the same as emotional instability. One is episodic, the other is intentional. And in Nick's case, the resentment toward his parents appeared consistent, directed, and deeply personal. By adulthood, Nick wasn't just cycling through rehab. He was cycling through people, friends, support systems, professionals. Anyone who tried to help eventually became another obstacle or another enemy. Witnesses describe escalating entitlement, explosive reactions, an inability to tolerate gratitude or praise being directed at anyone else, especially his father. That detail matters more than it seems, because gratitude, in this story, becomes the trigger. At a Thanksgiving dinner years later, multiple guests reportedly witnessed an incident that now reads less like family drama and more like psychological confirmation. As the meal began, Rob Reiner held a turkey drumstick, a simple tradition. One by one, family members shared what they were grateful for. When it reached Nick, the room froze. He reportedly exploded, declared he wasn't grateful for the food, or the people, or the house, then hurled the turkey leg across the table toward his father. This wasn't substance-fueled chaos. This wasn't confusion. This was symbolic. And symbolism matters in criminal psychology. Destroying moments of gratitude isn't about anger, it's about control. It's about refusing to let harmony exist unless it centers on you. Multiple experts reviewing the case would later describe this behavior as manipulative, narcissistic, and deeply intentional. They raise the critical contradiction the defense now faces. They argue the murders were the result of medication issues, of mental health mismanagement, of an isolated psychological break. But prosecutors are building something else entirely. They are constructing a timeline that shows hostility long before medication, aggression long before addiction, resentment long before crisis. That's why witnesses from Nick's teenage years suddenly matter again. Prosecutors don't revisit 15-year-old memories unless they need to prove premeditation of mindset. Not the act, but the intent behind it. And intent doesn't require a plan written on paper. It reveals itself through repetition. There's another piece most people overlook. Despite the money, despite the privacy, despite the access to elite treatment, Nick was never shielded from consequences because his parents didn't care. He was shielded because they hoped. Hope is not weakness. But hope without boundaries becomes dangerous. Private rehabs rarely call police unless forced. Not because they're hiding crimes, but because families want discretion. No paper trails. No permanent records. Especially when the child belongs to a powerful family. And that absence of official documentation, it doesn't erase behavior. It just delays accountability. Former security professionals familiar with these environments say violent incidents are often handled internally. Restrained, medicated, de-escalated, forgotten, until they aren't. By the time Nick reached adulthood, the anger had nowhere left to go except outward. And those closest to him say the hatred toward his parents never dissolved. It sharpened, which leads us to the moment prosecutors can't ignore. When the murders occurred, several people connected to the family reportedly had the same thought independently. It was him, not because they wanted it to be, because the pattern made it unavoidable. And now, every incident once dismissed as troubled youth behavior is being re-examined not as background noise, but as warning shots. Because when a story repeats itself for 15 years, it stops being a coincidence. It becomes a blueprint.
He walks around the block every day. He writes every day. Mel Brooks comes over to the house. They sit there. They have dinner. They watch a movie. Any movie with Secure the Perimeter in it.
That pattern collides with reality. Because whatever arguments exist about mental health, addiction, or medication actions still matter. And the actions taken on the night Rob and Michelle Riner were killed may be the most damaging evidence of all. This is where the narrative shifts from psychology to behavior, from history to decisions, from explanation to accountability. According to investigators, the crime itself did not unfold in chaos. It unfolded in sequence. There was a weapon, there was movement, there was an exit, and those details matter more than any diagnosis. Prosecutors are reportedly focused on one uncomfortable question: if Nick Riner was truly unaware of what he was doing, why did he leave? After the murders, Nick didn't remain at the scene. He didn't call for help. He didn't appear confused or disoriented in a way consistent with total psychological collapse. Instead, he walked away. Literally. Investigators say he traveled several miles on foot, checked into a hotel in Santa Monica, attempted to clean himself up, then later boarded public transportation in the middle of the night, heading toward an area where he was known to buy drugs. That sequence is devastating to an insanity defense because it shows goal-oriented behavior. You don't flee a scene you don't understand. You don't create distance, physical, emotional, psychological, unless you know what you're distancing yourself from. Former FBI analysts reviewing the case have emphasized this point repeatedly. Escape behavior is not random. It is intentional. It reflects awareness. And awareness destroys the claim that this was a momentary break from reality. Even more troubling is what investigators expect to recover from the hotel. Evidence logs, items handled, movement patterns, possibly even attempts to discard or clean clothing. Each of those steps tells a story not of confusion, but of calculation. Then there's the knife. Where did it come from? When was it accessed? Was it retrieved in the moment or already nearby? Prosecutors don't need to prove long-term planning. They only need to show preparation before action. And every indication so far suggests Nick didn't act impulsively in a fog. He acted decisively in anger. This is where Section 1 and Section 2 suddenly become relevant again. Because when a 15-year-old repeatedly expresses hatred toward his parents, when that resentment continues into adulthood, when multiple witnesses describe manipulation, entitlement, and violent outbursts, then the crime stops looking spontaneous. It starts looking inevitable. The defense may argue that addiction blurred his judgment, that medication altered his perception, that mental illness drove the act. But prosecutors are prepared to counter with a simple question: if this was illness, why did it follow the same emotional direction for 15 years? Illness is chaotic. Patterns are not. And there's another detail quietly unsettling investigators. Nick didn't run randomly. He ran toward familiarity, toward routines, toward places he knew. That suggests presence of mind, not absence of it. He wasn't lost. He wasn't wandering. He was navigating. Experts say this kind of behavior often reflects an attempt to regain control after doing something irreversible, to escape not just consequences, but reality itself. And that brings us to the most uncomfortable truth emerging in this case. This wasn't about money. It wasn't about fame. It wasn't even about addiction. It was about resentment left untreated and uncontained for years. Resentment that survived therapy. Resentment that survived rehab. Resentment that outlasted every second chance. When the crime finally happened, it didn't create a new person. It revealed the one that had been there all along. Which leaves one final question hanging, and it's the question that will dominate the trial if so many people saw this coming. Why did no one stop it?
Which I didn't know that they even had lyrics. And I think Albert Brooks was on,
That's
and
right.
Billy Crystal, and Harry Shearer, and I think Penny Marshall was on.
By the time Rob and Michelle Riner were killed, the story was no longer just about one man. It was about a system layered, expensive, well-intentioned, and ultimately ineffective. Because when something goes wrong this many times over this many years, responsibility doesn't vanish. It spreads. Nick Riner didn't grow up without resources. He grew up surrounded by them. Elite doctors, private security, luxury rehab centers, expert consultants, all designed to intervene before tragedy. And yet, none of it stopped what happened. That forces an uncomfortable question: did the system protect Nick, or did it protect everyone from Nick? Private rehab facilities operate under medical confidentiality. Incidents are handled internally. Physical altercations are restrained, documented quietly, and rarely escalated to law enforcement unless someone is seriously injured. Families, especially wealthy, high-profile families, often prefer it that way. No police reports, no public records, no trail. On the surface, this looks like compassion. In practice, it can become concealment. Former security professionals describe a culture where problems are managed, not confronted, where bad behavior is de-escalated, not punished, where consequences are softened in the hope that treatment will eventually work. But hope is not accountability. And over time, Nick learned something dangerous. There was always another program, another second chance, another buffer between his actions and real-world consequences. That doesn't mean his parents failed him. It means they believed the experts. Rob and Michelle Riner weren't negligent. They were persistent. They trusted systems designed to help families like theirs, systems that promise solutions in exchange for privacy and patience. Yet the very structure of those systems may have delayed the moment Nick finally had to face reality. When violence erupted, it was contained. When rage surfaced, it was medicated. When entitlement grew, it was excused as illness. And when gratitude disappeared entirely, no one forced its return. That pattern matters now because it undercuts a central defense narrative that this tragedy was unavoidable, that nothing more could have been done. But evidence suggests the opposite. Consequences were consistently reduced. Boundaries were repeatedly softened. Authority was always external, never final. Experts say some individuals don't respond to treatment alone. They respond to limits. And Nick may never have truly encountered one until the night everything collapsed. Now, the irony is brutal. The same privacy that once protected the family can no longer shield the truth. Witnesses from decades ago are resurfacing. Former roommates, dinner guests, security professionals, therapists, friends, each carrying fragments of a story that no longer fits neatly into a medical explanation. The prosecution isn't trying to argue that Nick didn't struggle. They're arguing that his struggle didn't cause the crime. And that distinction could decide everything. Because if the jury sees this as a failure of treatment, sympathy enters the room. If they see it as a failure of accountability, sympathy leaves. This case also exposes something larger than one family. It raises questions about how society handles violent behavior when it appears inside privilege. How wealth can delay consequences. How good intentions can sometimes do harm. And how warning signs are often recognized but ignored until they become irreversible. As the trial approaches, more stories will surface, some worse than the ones already known. And each will add weight to a single, haunting idea: this wasn't a sudden tragedy. It was a slow-moving one. When the trial begins, the courtroom won't just be judging Nick Riner. It will be judging every moment that led to him. From a teenage bedroom in Malibu where hatred was whispered in the dark, to Thanksgiving tables where gratitude was shattered, to a night where anger finally crossed a line it could never return from. This case isn't about whether Nick was troubled. That's no longer in dispute. It's about whether those troubles excuse what came next. The most unsettling part isn't what happened, it's how many people saw pieces of it coming. How many moments, spread across years, now look like warnings instead of memories. And when the verdict eventually arrives, one question will linger long after the courtroom empties: was this tragedy the result of illness, or the result of a system that confused compassion with avoidance? That answer won't just define this case. It will define how we respond the next time warning signs appear quietly, early, and easy to ignore. Subscribe for continued investigative coverage as this story unfolds.